After how much fun I had making my game ranking last year, I spent the whole year subconsciously looking forward to working on this. When I was looking back at the games I played at the end of last year, I tried to make an effort to play an even bigger variety, and that's how I ended up with 70 games on this list. That can also be accredited to trying more short games, not wasting as much time on a game if I'm not enjoying it, but also personal circumstances. I went from having one job, to no job, to a different job, and then 2 jobs, and I also now live with friends who game as well, so more gaming in my free time, leading to even more games on this list. Luckily, I've gotten better at working out what I like and won't like, so while I did find some enjoyment with almost every entry, I still got plenty of opinions. I could spend ages explaining myself, but let's get on to the games I played in 2023. This first part is unfortunately going to be the most negative, and that can't be avoided. I can understand how some people can enjoy these games, and to those people I hope entry by entry I can explain why I didn't. But the further we get through, the last half of this part especially, will be games I enjoyed, but just had significant issues with. But for now, let's start from the bottom. While there are games on this list which I think are objectively worse than Rune Factory 5, it was my worst gaming experience of the year for how much time I put in and how little it felt like I was getting out of it. I'd put almost 20 hours into Rune Factory 5 before I eventually decided to give up, and in that time it felt like I'd barely made a change in the game, which apparently I was halfway through the story of. Part of this might have been oversights on my behalf, but every few hours I would look up at Vice forums, tip videos, and I really wasn't doing anything that wrong. But everything just felt so incohesive, and I kept thinking that the gameplay would get more interesting, whether it was the life sim, the farming, the combat, the dungeon exploration, the dating sim, but it all felt randomly distributed and lacked any real depth. The life sim elements were fine but weren't particularly rewarding, the farming felt bare bones, and the combat was using the most basic action RPG mechanics at their worst. The dungeons were sporadic and essentially just cycled through the Rolodex of RPG dungeon elements, the nature one, the volcano one, the ice one, etc. And while the dating sim was apparently there based on the relationship menu I could access at any time, none of the characters ever had any personal development and very few unique interactions, in spite of how many of their favourite foods I would throw at them. And also, whenever this game is discussed, it really does feel like the elephant in the room, but it looks really bad. Sure, some Switch games look subpar, especially if they're ports, but this game was a Switch exclusive at launch in 2021. Like, sure, if it was a massive open world game, then yeah, some areas might look janky, but how does the average size hub town look like assets thrown in a blender made in 2006? And honestly, that's a disservice to games from 2006. In spite of all of this, I didn't actually hate Rune Factory 5. I'm sure some people put more time into it and ended up with a more satisfying experience, and I could occasionally see moments of charm slip through with some dialogue and details. But when I'm on my deathbed, I think I'm going to want the 18 hours I spent on it back. Neither God of Rock nor Rune Factory 5 are great games, far from it, but even though Rune Factory 5 is probably better objectively, I appreciate what God of Rock was going for, even though it didn't really succeed with any of it. I picked it up spontaneously on sale, then got a bit of buyer's remorse after glancing over average review scores, but then regained a bit of hope when seeing it was nominated for Best Fighting Game at the Game Awards, but upon actually playing it, my negative expectations for the game were unfortunately fulfilled. If you haven't heard of it before, God of Rock is a rhythm fighting hybrid where the better you do at the rhythm game, the better you're doing in the fight, and you can do certain moves to obstruct your opponent. But this combination just never falls into place. The connection between your fighting and skill at the rhythm game just never seems to connect unless you're doing awfully, and the rhythm gameplay feels unresponsive, which is kind of a death knell in this genre. The main gameplay mode, like most fighting games, is an arcade mode, but it's scaled really poorly, since even on lower difficulties, at the end of the arcade mode you'll be facing extreme difficulty tracks, which when you're trying a normal difficulty arcade setting feels almost impossible, especially when the CPU is nailing it, making the difficulty exponentially harder. Even worse considering the music used in the game is pretty generic video game background music, which would be fine for a standard game, but not for a rhythm game. I honestly was attracted to it since I enjoy most rhythm games, but also the character designs looked interesting and I like the style, even if some of them look like Dislike knockoffs. But it kind of sucks that the background you get for them is minimal, and you can barely appreciate them when playing because you have to stare at the rhythm track the whole time. I desperately wanted to like God of Rock since it has a relatively strong concept and style, but the core gameplay was badly executed, making it feel like I was playtesting, not playing a final product, which is apparently a contender for best fighting game of the year. I hope the team who worked on it can maybe make some drastic changes with a sequel or a new start, since there is something here which could work. Compared to the last two entries, this game is a lot more competent, but it's so low because of how disappointing it was. I played the original Pokken Tournament when it launched on the Wii U and remembered enjoying it, but since it had been so long since then, I thought it'd be a good time to revisit the Switch port which added characters and supports. Upon my return to a game I remembered liking, I realised three things. Firstly, the gameplay, while flashy, lacked much substance. Secondly, the new characters were fine, but didn't actually add much to the game. And lastly, the story mode had been left unchanged and unimproved. The single player progression essentially includes battles upon battles and then stakeless tournaments to work up ranks that just require more and more battles, with occasional intermissions of the narrator talking about a Dark Mewtwo. The sheer quantity of meaningless repetitive fights in the same boring settings but with some Pokemon in the background quickly grew grating. Also, the game actually discouraged trying different fighters out, with a single player defaulting to using your partner Pokemon. So if you want to change, you have to exit all the way out of the story mode, into the trainer settings, then back out and load up the story mode again, and you can only do this at certain intervals. Of course, in a fighting game you can expect to do lots of fights, but the way this was structured made it feel unfathomably grindy, for very little reward. And after I'd made my way through about 3/4 of the story, I saw how many battles needed to be done to finish it, considered how little I cared about the story, and left it. I wish I just left this game as a fond memory of the Wii U era instead of going back to revisit it, but at least now I won't want to come back for a third attempt. I'd heard great things from a friend who loved this remake of a childhood favourite, and since licensed games usually don't get much attention for long after they release, this one getting a remake so late on must be an indicator of how good it is, right? Battle for Bikini Bottom was fun for a little while, but as I was worried of going in, the signs of its age couldn't really be covered up with modern graphics which if anything maybe detract from the charm of the original, turning beloved cartoon characters into dead-eyed, stiff-moving caricatures. 3D platformers with open-ended designs letting you dot between different areas in whatever order can be fun, but the lack of any sense of progression makes them hard to get through, especially if they aren't short. Exploring these worlds can be fun, but the charm tends to wear thin, even more so if you aren't the target audience, and I think mindlessly exploring these sandboxes is a lot more fun when your age is in the single digits, or if you're a massive fan of the sponge. And while I enjoy the show, I didn't really grow up with it enough to motivate me to work through this game. What does interest me though is that after the success of this game, it got a sequel, and with that being a wholly modern project, it could have the better structure, pacing, and look that might interest me to actually reach the credits instead of quitting halfway like I did with this one. I played SpongeBob because it was free with PS Plus, and like that, the Happy Home Paradise of New Horizons was free with a Nintendo Online expansion pass, and since I didn't want to renew it again, I thought I might as well try it. While it disguises itself as a game and even structures itself similarly, Happy Home Paradise is a 10-hour-long sequence that you need to complete to get more decoration options for the base game. It has charming presentation with some sweet new characters and occasional distractions like designing other buildings like shops, a hospital or a school, but at its core you'll be decorating around 30 houses, get a cute DJ KK cameo, and then credits. It's a fun distraction, and if I was more actively playing the base game, I think I would have enjoyed it more, but when I stopped playing New Horizons, I came away from it pretty jaded. I love New Leaf, but New Horizons was clearly moving away from the life sim elements I enjoyed, and towards a tailor-made town decorator I wasn't as interested in, and Happy Home Paradise is just an extension of that. Having more decoration options is great, especially if you love that aspect of Animal Crossing, but I can't help but be skeptical and assume the context for unlocking these features is just a justification for Nintendo to be able to ask half the cost of the original game for this expansion pass, which is why I am happy I didn't directly pay for it, but for those who did and don't care about decorating too much, I express my condolences. Bloodroots is one of those games I picked up on sale and had fun with for a little while, but like a lot of repetitive try and try again arcade style games, the charm wore off pretty fast. The level structure at least made it easy to pick up and play, but I find that games with this structure are just as easy to put down. The simple concept of grabbing weapons with limited uses to get past enemies that will instantly kill you was occasionally fun, and with the level layout the pacing was kept relatively tight, but that was held back by the need for repetition on harder, longer levels without many or any checkpoints. And by the time I reached the first major boss, it was a longer level with fewer checkpoints and a massive difficulty spike. I realized that I could be playing something else, and I haven't looked back, except to write this, I guess. Difficult repetitive games can be fun, I know because I enjoy other ones, but if the core gameplay isn't engaging enough, going for another attempt quickly stops being appealing. I bought Pathless a little while ago and had it sitting on my shelf waiting for when I wanted a fun, short game with a fresh concept. So when I finally thought it was time to play, I was disappointed that the progression system killed the pacing, and the core concept of long distance traversal sped up by hitting targets was nowhere near as satisfying as it looked, and I soured on it a lot quicker than I would have hoped. The main issue is that the game requires you to scour the areas it presents to you, squeeze out almost all of the content before you're allowed to progress onto the next section of the story, and when the areas are so lacking in much interesting going on and the puzzles you're searching for are mostly unintuitive and rarely engaging, my willpower drained quickly. It would have been easier if speeding around the environments was as rewarding as it looks in footage, but in practice the momentary speed boosts just make everything else feel slower. What sucks about this is with some minor tweaking, maybe requiring fewer points to progress, or some improvement to the traversal, this would have felt a lot more rewarding to play. But as it is, I couldn't force myself past a certain point. Sticking to the standard worst to best ranking order sometimes leads to weird situations where if I like a sequel less than the original in the same year, I'll have to talk about it first, and that's what's going to happen with the second game in the Atelier Ryza trilogy. Not to spoil how much higher the first Atelier Ryza game is, but when the original succeeds so well at what it does, it feels a little nonsensical that the follow-up need to reinvent the wheel so aggressively. While elements are retained, both the combat and the alchemy were changed pretty drastically, and since, in my opinion, both are done worse than they were in the original, it's hard not to compare it to something I had previously thought they'd already got perfect. One of the main things I enjoyed about the original was the characters, and the character-focused narrative, and this was kept in the sequel, but a whole new range of characters are added to the party, and because I care about the original cast, there being such a strong focus on the less interesting new ones, I found it harder to enjoy. Because I still enjoyed that core cast, I'm probably going to come back to this so I can continue and finish the trilogy. It's a shame, but when a game is a direct sequel, it's hard not to compare it to what came before it. And while some changes are positive, like quality of life adjustments, if almost everything else is worse, it'll be hard not to miss what once was. Bully, or Canis Canem Edit if you're following government regulations, is a game with a lot of personality, and that's what drew me to it. But playing through half of the campaign made me realize that I don't think that I love the story structure of Rockstar games, and since this one feels noticeably dated, the issues are magnified. The idea of a Rockstar game set in a private school works well, but it just felt a bit janky in execution. I think at the time of release it would have been quite impressive, and if I had some more time to just mess around in the open world and discover all the secrets, then I might have been more immersed. But playing it in 2023 without any modern quality of life improvements and a story which just didn't grab me, I couldn't really be too bothered to keep going. It's the kind of game I can see myself enjoying under different circumstances, since a more linear GTA style game which has a tighter narrative would be interesting, but the lack of polish getting more and more obvious as the game ages makes it hard. But if you played and enjoyed it when it came out, I can see why you would consider it an underrated classic. Not to be a contrarian, but when it was released as a side story for the Mario 3D World port on Switch, I saw Bowser's Fury got a pretty good reception, but when I played it through, it all just felt a little bare. As a proof of concept for an open setting Mario 3D platformer, I think it works, but if you look at it in isolation, it feels a bit empty. The platforming was fun enough, but it lacked the pacing and sense of momentum you get from a more linear level of 3D Mario, like the ones in 3D World. And the setting, while it had some charm early on, just didn't have much going on and felt like a bunch of 3D platforming areas were just mashed together in one map. The intermittent Bowser boss fights were fine, but since it was the same thing made nominally harder throughout the game's short run, it quickly started to become repetitive. It was a cute idea, and getting to see more Bowser Jr. is always a great thing. And while yes, maybe this idea could work with some tweaking on a bigger scale, it would need a bit more going on than there is in Bowser's Fury. As a revival of Saints Row, I think we all know that Saints Row 2022 failed miserably, enough to be the final failure of their studio, but looking at it by itself, I think it's massively overhated. That's not to say it's an amazing game, but it had some fun moments, tightly paced missions, and characterization which was surprisingly engaging. The core cast from this game was one of the biggest criticisms I'd seen for the story, and while they are imperfect, especially in isolation, the friendship between them and how this developed throughout the campaign was really fun to watch. I didn't take my time with Saints Row 2022, especially since it did pale in comparison to how much fun I had playing 4 a few years ago, and I could tell my willingness to play the game would wane as time went on. In spite of this, I did indulge in some side content, and one of the best moments by far is the LARPing side quest, which has your character and the gang get involved in Santo Eliso's live action role-playing scene, raiding cardboard bases, fake assassinations and mock weapons. It was definitely a highlight of the campaign, and an unfortunately short look at the more wacky moments that made the previous Saints Row games more fun, even if the final cutscene for the mission completely bugged out. There are plenty of issues with this game, and they've all been closely documented, and when this game failed, I was massively disappointed due to how much I enjoyed previous entries, but this game is far from the irredeemable dog shit some fans make it out to be. At the start of this year, I almost played One Piece Odyssey when it released, since a turn-based One Piece adventure looked like a lot of fun, but I missed the boat and didn't end up picking it up until a mid-year sale. But at that point, I didn't want to play it since I was catching up with the main series and didn't want to get burned out by oversaturating myself with One Piece content. So by the time I caught up to the series and had left it for a little while, I was ready to play a One Piece game. So what did I pick? Shonen Jump's One Piece for Game Boy Advance. This beat-em-up platformer hybrid is a unique artifact, being the first One Piece game ever released outside of Japan, but also not being a localized game. This is in fact an original game made exclusively for the North American release using assets from previous Japan-exclusive One Piece games. It was made to cross-promote with the infamous One Piece 4Kids dub. The game luckily misses out on all of the issues people had with this version of the anime, since the game doesn't have any of the memorable voice acting,
Luffy! It's good to see you, buddy!
And doesn't have any of the censorship either, with the only real remnants being Zoro called Zolo and Chaser instead of Smoker. The game itself is short, splitting the first 50 episodes or 100 chapters into 6 levels, split into 2 stages and a boss each. The gameplay is a little awkward sometimes, with some bosses and platforming sections feeling a little unfair, especially when you have a life system in place, but if like me, you're using save states, then it's nowhere near as much of a problem. The nostalgia for this early saga of One Piece was lacking a little since the live action adaptation just came out recently and covered the exact same stories in a lot more detail, but as a throwback, it's an entertaining and short license game that's refreshing if you're craving something One Piece but you don't want to play a Warriors game or a long RPG. Sackboy: A Big Adventure is technically a very good game. It's a creative 3D platformer that clearly had a lot of love and time put into it, and it's very competently crafted and put together, but it was just clearly made for a very young audience. I would usually be an advocate for games being for everyone and you can enjoy whatever you want, but there is something about the aesthetic of the Little Big Planet universe's style which I just don't resonate with, and almost find it patronising. I don't know if it's the narration or random British celebrities being brought in to voice act, but I just don't vibe with it, which sucks because I was playing through this incredibly well-paced, well-designed adventure thinking I should be enjoying this, but something about it just made me glaze over and go with emotions. I was making a conscious effort to get through a lot of my PS Plus backlog this year, so that's why I pushed myself to reach credits, but if I wasn't pushing myself to get my money's worth from a subscription I'm about to cancel, I would have probably dropped it a bit earlier. There's a good chance that if you enjoy 3D platformers, you'll enjoy this, but that unfortunately wasn't the case for me. After picking up the Analog Pocket in December, I was on the lookout for oddball GBA games which I never considered playing. That was the reason I played One Piece, and discovered Courier in Paradise. The first game in the series is more accessible, with it being available on Nintendo Switch Online, but this one, which has been heralded as the best in the series, was a Japanese exclusive and therefore not translated. In my years of gaming, I've never tried to play a game without English text, but I assume that since this game has such a simple and satisfying concept that I wouldn't run into any issues. And to be honest, for the most part I didn't. Compared to long plays that I've checked, I played most of the levels, which have a cute 2000s cartoon aesthetic and got quite challenging in spite of appearances. But at some point the progression to unlock some final levels required beating some pretty janky minigames, so I just gave up, especially since I couldn't peruse the menus to work out what I was missing. With how much fun I had, even though I couldn't understand anything, the game deserves praise. It's also nice to play a fun little simple concept game like this, which if it was made now, 21 years later, it would be a free-to-play mobile game with over 2,000 levels and a microtransaction life system forcing you to pay up if you want more than 5 minutes of playtime. Back in June, it was a Nintendo Online Platinum Point mission to play Kirby Tilt and Tumble, and since the rewards aren't as trash as they used to be, I tried it out. Similarly to Kururin, it's a simple concept game that wouldn't really get made nowadays, and the motion control gimmick was actually put to good use, even if it is undeniably a gimmick. Nintendo essentially saw those plastic roller toys where you get the tiny ball through the maze and thought, what if it was Kirby? I can imagine this game would have been pretty infuriating natively on the Game Boy with the original life and game over system, but the pacing was a lot better with save states, otherwise I likely wouldn't have got nearly as far as I did. It was nothing jaw-dropping, but I can see how at release the motion controls would have been more impressive, but in a post-Wii world, that glimmer is obviously lacking now. A fun distraction to play amidst longer games, and for free, it's hard to complain when it was so well emulated by Nintendo on the Switch. And just one spot above the motion-controlled Kirby spin-off is Game of the Year 2015 winner The Witcher 3. I think if I played this in 2015 I would have had a lot more fun, and while I know that a lot of people still love this game, I just couldn't get into it. And not for lack of effort. I got a third of the way through the massive story, tried plenty of side quests, tried Gwent, and put in over 20 hours, but after that and seeing how much I still had ahead of me, I just had to give it an indefinite break. While the world looks amazing with the next gen update and exploring it was often a lot of fun, I just didn't really enjoy playing it that much. With the power of retrospect, I recognise that my main issue was the lack of development in Geralt's abilities. Almost everything he could do 20 hours in was something he could do 1 hour in, and while his numbers were bigger thanks to leveling up and getting new gear, since everything else was scaling around him, playing it didn't really feel that different at all. And while the world looks amazing, I'm not really a fan of low fantasy that much, so I was never too tempted to get lost and just explore. Aside from how intangible the progression in Geralt's abilities felt, most of my issues with The Witcher 3 are mostly superficial and based on taste. I just don't think I was in the place to spend so many more hours on a game which I enjoyed for a while, but was quickly losing the momentum to keep me engaged. Out of all the games on this list that I've dropped, this is the one I can see myself most likely to return to, but probably not that soon. Endless Dungeon is a lot of things, being both a tower defense game, a genre I usually enjoy but rarely go out of my way for, and a twin stick shooter, a genre I'd barely played before. But it's also structured like a roguelite, a genre I either love or hate. And there is a lot I loved about Endless Dungeon, but also enough holding it back that it dragged itself this far down the list. The combination of the three core genres works quite well for a while, and even though the runs can be quite long, they are relatively well paced, and the gameplay was often pretty satisfying, if not a little repetitive, no matter which character I was using. A noticeable issue I ran into was bugs, which was a massive disappointment. The most obvious, which is a widespread issue for almost every player on certain consoles, is whenever you would try and level up the crystal bot, which is a tower which you're defending, during your run, the game would crash. Since it autosaves regularly, the run wouldn't be lost, but losing a whole system of progression in each run was an unnecessary limitation that took so long to fix that by the time it was, I'd long since abandoned the game. On top of this, while the pacing of each run was fine, the pacing of the overarching narrative was incredibly slow, and practically crawled to a halt at a certain point. The difficulty was less on a slope and more of a cliff face, requiring massive amounts of time and effort to get to the ending right at the point where the game had ran out of new content to give you. Issues like this will likely be fixed, but playing Endless Dungeon in its launch era felt incredibly demoralizing. And while the first half of the game was a lot of fun, there was little to no motivation to push through to the ending. Side note worth mentioning though, the soundtrack was so good, perfectly matching the environment and atmosphere of each level, so it's a shame that so few people are going to get to properly appreciate it since this game never really took off, and in the state it's in, I doubt it will. Compared to a lot of the games below it on the list, I think Trek to Yomi has a lot more technical failings, but also, in a reversal of Sackboy, I just enjoyed what it was going for more, and that redeemed a lot of its more objective issues. The strong style was amplified by the forced camera angles that ensure you're getting the best view of each part of the setting you traverse through. The linear design meant the pacing was pretty great as well, even if it sometimes grinded to a halt in some challenging areas with too long between checkpoints, forcing you to replay long sections. The combat was simple but effective, and since it wasn't too complex, it fit the game's short runtime perfectly. It did start to wear a little thin in later levels, but just as I was starting to get over it, the game was wrapping up. I've seen a lot of people accuse it of being completely style over substance, and I think that stems from the linear design and simple combat, which is understandable, but for me that doesn't really ruin a game, it just simply makes it more linear. If it looks like the kind of thing you'll enjoy, especially if you like Kurosawa films, then give it a try, especially if it's on sale. But on the same hand, if it doesn't seem like your thing at all, then it's easy to skip. I kind of thought I was a little bit of a disgrace of a so-called Nintendo fan for not having played any Star Fox games, even if it was one of their more overlooked IPs in the last decade, so when I saw the 3DS remake of the most popular entry in the series, I thought I would try it out. In the course of a day, I did one playthrough and it was absolutely fine. It was a great looking game on the 3DS with a lot of effort clearly having gone into smoothing it out from the N64 original, and the choice of different levels was a nice variety which gives me a good incentive to maybe pick it up again one day. But after one playthrough, I'd had my fill. I was perfectly satiated and happy to move on. It's a shame that rail shooters are a dying breed, since games like this are a lot of fun, and their potential is clear with amazing games like Kid Icarus Uprising pushing the limits for what they can achieve. I don't want to compare Star Fox 64 to one of my all-time favourites, since the original is 20 years older, so I won't, since it's honestly unfair. Even if this game didn't blow my mind, I appreciate how it impacted the genre and laid foundations for even better games to come. It's pretty criminal that the last Punch-Out game is almost 15 years old with no signs of a sequel on the horizon. In spite of this, thanks to the timeless art style and intuitive controls of the latest entry from back on the Wii, it's still accessible and fun to go back to. If you've ever been tempted to try Punch-Out, this is where I'd recommend you start, with the animations looking amazing and the difficulty scaling perfectly to help you get better. But I had one main issue, and that was with saving. The game is split into 3 leagues with 4 matches in the first 2 and then 5 on the third, and you can only save once you've finished a league. With the game's difficulty, these fights that unless you're a prodigy will take multiple attempts, and especially in the last league can take a lot of time to get past. This really sucks since you're essentially held captive by the game until you finish a league, unless you want to lose what could be a massive chunk of gameplay. This is likely a throwback to this series' old school origins, but if you want a throwback, put that in presentation or gameplay, not in missing out on pretty foundational quality of life features. It made approaching play sessions pretty intimidating since I knew I would be stuck playing for a while, especially on that last challenge with 5 consecutive fights to learn and perfect. The game would be so much higher if it didn't have this issue, and I'm hoping it gets a port which remedies it, or just a well-deserved sequel at this point. You might remember Daemon X Machina as that game which got a pretty big announcement trailer at Nintendo's E3 in 2018, the same one which spent most of its time on Smash Ultimate. And while the trailer never convinced me to buy the game, when it was being given away for free on Epic Games Store, I thought I'd at least try it, even if that meant having to use their launcher. The core mech gameplay was actually a lot of fun, and it didn't take long for speeding around the stylized interactive maps to feel completely natural. This gameplay being fun is what pushed me through to the end, with some interesting missions and most bosses being a spectacle-filled challenge. Luckily the game wasn't too long, so the core gameplay was fresh enough to last the whole runtime, but not by much since the time I had dealt with the slightly cheap final boss, I was ready to retire. The storytelling was also completely off the wall. I tried to keep up with it near the start, but more and more characters kept getting introduced, to the point where I felt it was a joke that the cast had grown to over 20. With so much random shit being thrown around with this massive cast of characters that have barely any discernible traits, the context for the missions quickly got tuned out and eventually skipped altogether. If you can find it for a good deal and you've never played a mech game like this, I would honestly recommend it as a good starting point. But if you're looking for an engaging story or really anything aside from the mech gameplay, then look elsewhere. When the gameplay of Fast RMX hits, it hits hard and is a lot of fun to play through, and since it's a game without any context, just gameplay, it didn't take nearly as much of my time. However, because of that complete lack of context, it meant that it also lacked any personality, and means I'm even more critical of the gameplay since that's all it has. And like I said, that core gameplay is fun, putting its own spin on the F-Zero formula with a color-coded boosting mechanic that adds an extra layer to concentrate on when playing. But once I'd played every track, done well enough in every cup, unlocked all the cars, I just didn't feel much reason to keep going. I'd hit credits, played with some friends, and just felt like I'd seen all there is to see. It's a strong racing game I'll return to whenever I have time to kill and access to my Switch, but because of the difficulty, it's quite hard to just introduce to most friends in a casual setting, which for a racing game severely limits how much I'm going to get out of it. This is my third foray into the Monster Hunter series, and the first time I played it truly as God intended, multiplayer. That means the repetition inherent to the series didn't set in as quickly and meant that missions were a lot more fun and engaging to complete, but it also meant that I'd finally realised my issues with Monster Hunter might be a bit deeper than just not having people to play it with. For context, I played 4 Ultimate back on the 3DS and Rise last year, and a trend I've noticed is each time I've played them less and less. I put hours upon hours into 4, went quite far past the credits in Rise, but after getting to the credits of World and having seen most of the monsters included, I just didn't feel the need to keep going. Even with the streamlining world added to the Monster Hunter series, the lack of motivation to keep playing was still obvious. With this being my third time trying the series, noticing the loop of better gear for harder monsters to better gear became noticeable even quicker. If that's fun for you and you love the more intricate character building, extra difficulty aspects of the Monster Hunter series, then that probably sounds amazing, but for a more casual fan, that just doesn't appeal. Even though the teasers for the next Monster Hunter title look impressive, this time I'm going to abstain for longer, so by the next time I return to the series I can come at it from a much fresher perspective. As a massive Bayonetta fan, I went into Astral Chain with slight reservation but high expectations, and it mostly delivered. The core combat system was great, with the different legions you unlock throughout the game all feeling different and fun to use. It incentivized trying out different styles. The unique gameplay with the legions also had some fun overlap with the overworld exploration, which often led to some interesting traversal and platforming sections. My main issue with Astral Chain is a lack of editing when it came to what to include in the final game. It's one of those games which you'll remember fondly and maybe want to revisit, but then you'll remember, oh, I don't want to do that section. And unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of what that section might be. It could be drawn out investigation sequences, stealth sections that just overstay their welcome, and even a couple whole chapters that just kill the pacing of the entire game. I like what Platinum were going for with something slower paced than Bayonetta, where you can explore, backtrack, and take your time with side content, and when that worked, it worked well, but when it missed, it just felt incredibly unsatisfying. I took a massive hiatus from Astral Chain because I was tired of how long it was taking me to get through, and since the narrative wasn't particularly strong, especially the closer I got to the conclusion, I just didn't feel the need to continue. But I picked it back up and pushed to the end, but essentially ignored all side content and just fast tracked to the end. I'll fondly remember the good parts of Astral Chain because there were plenty of them, but I hope a sequel will build upon the strong foundations and create a better, more refined experience. Spoilers to my game ranking from last year, but the 2020 remake of Final Fantasy VII was the best thing I played all year, so going back to that setting for the Intergrade DLC was something I was massively excited for, and it didn't really disappoint me that much since I got to formally meet Yuffie, who is a lot of fun, and go on a short but interesting enough adventure with her teasing the next entry in the remake trilogy, and my favourite character from the main story, Roche, even had a cameo. It feels slightly superficial, but my main issue with this quite short campaign was the setting. A highlight of 7 Remake was how amazing all of the different areas in Midgar looked, so when Intergrade largely retreaded the same areas, only really adding some new sections to existing areas, or an extended factory trip, I just couldn't help but be a bit let down. The gameplay was still fun, but the sense of exploration and progression felt so stagnant compared to the main game and makes us feel like it just blends in. You would think that a new story made for the PS5 would take full advantage of the extra graphical capabilities, but looking at Intergrade, you wouldn't really think that. As an extension to what is now one of my favourite games ever, I can't help but feel that it just didn't do enough to be worth the extra cost to play it.
1, 2, 3!
Hopefully the bottom 25 wasn't too negative, but I'm looking forward to the middle 25 even more since those are the games I'll likely have the most mixed feelings about. That'll be this time next week, but if you just can't wait that long to hear me keep talking about games like this, check out my ranking from 2022. Or if you just want a break from my rankings, I mainly do more retrospective video essay style stuff, but if you just want a reminder for when the next part is out, then subscribing will be the easiest. I want to keep the outro very short since I'm going to do a proper one for the final part of the video, so for now, I'll see you in part 2 this time next week.